Hello, this is Aaron Wren. Welcome back to the show. I am honored and delighted to have a truly special guest with me today. That is Robert Woodson Sr., Bob Woodson. He is one of America's foremost civil rights leaders and experts on poverty alleviation. He's been an advisor to presidents. He has won a MacArthur Genius Grant. He has many honors that if I listed them all, we would be here a while. He is the president of the Woodson Center in Washington and editor of the new book, A Pathway to American Renewal, Volume 2. There are links both to the Woodson Center and to buy the book in the show notes. Mr. Woodson, thank you so much for coming on my show. It is a great honor today.
Pleased to be here.
I really wanted to have you on the show because much of my audience is evangelical Christian, and I have been very dissatisfied with the way evangelicals have talked about race. It seems to be a variation of sort of a woke side and an anti-woke side, neither of which seems to have particularly compelling answers or a lot of depth to their analysis. So I wanted to have you on to hopefully point us in some productive directions. So first, when I look at the world, I see there's been undeniable progress on racial equality. We've passed civil rights acts, fair housing acts, voting rights acts. We've seen the emergence of a black middle class, a black upper middle class, even wealthy black Americans. We've had black Fortune 500 CEOs, even a black president of the United States. And yet there's still tremendous disparities on many measures in our society between races. So just wealth, the example I just pulled was wealth. In 2022, median black household wealth was $44,890. Median white household income wealth was $285,000. And, there do remain isolated, sizable areas of our cities that are essentially 100% poor and black, many of which exist side by side with some of America's wealthiest areas. How should we think about where we've come and where we are? And again, I know there's a lot of this in the book, so feel free to refer to the book. We're here to promote the book too.
Well, thank you for having me on. Part of my introduction, I'd like to add that the question is, as the Apostle Paul said, who were you before you were baptized?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm from South Philadelphia, low-income black neighborhood at a time during segregation in 1937, right in the midst of the Depression. But 98% of all black households had a man and a woman raising children. Elderly people could walk safely in those communities without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren, and never heard a gunfire, never heard. So there's just this myth that some of the problems that we're facing today is somehow a legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. That is patently untrue. Another fact is you cannot really generalize about any populations and say, well, there's a wealth gap between whites and blacks, and it doesn't help you at all, because if you disaggregate that number, there are 1,600,000 blacks who are millionaires.
Mm. Yeah.
There are, if you want to compare, and when you look at poverty, black poverty, it dramatically reduces if the couple, low-income couple, is married.
Mm-hmm.
Nigerians have a higher income education level than blacks.
Mm-hmm.
There was a survey of the 10 poorest counties in America. 6 of those counties were all white. The
Mm-hmm.
other 4 were Native American reservations. And over the last 5 decades in those low-income white counties, the income never came over $15,000. So it's not helpful to conflate poor with black and somehow say that because of this generalized disparity between upper income whites and blacks, you're putting Oprah Winfrey in the mix with some black woman living in public housing. That's not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And as a veteran of the civil rights movement, the conditions that we were confronting in the 60s of having a segregated society are no longer existing today. And we need to stop acting as if listening to the race grievance race mongers, who keep telling you this lie that somehow America is that the problems that we're confronting today in the inner city of poverty, out of wedlock births, is related to the history of slavery and Jim Crow. It's just not true. And in our books, we demonstrate that. For instance, between 1930 and 1940, during the Depression, when the unemployment rate for whites was 25%, the unemployment rate for blacks was 40%, yet we had the highest marriage rate of any group in society. And we had, because all of our households were also Christian, we went to church. And so we must rely on fact-based truths, or lies will become normal.
Right.
And in our books, we document that when whites were at their worst, blacks were at their best. Let's take education, for instance. We look at only 3% of kids in Baltimore public schools are reading at grade level. And this is true throughout the society. Well, some would argue, but that's a legacy of slaves. Not so. In our essays, we looked at 5 major high schools at the turn of the century. One was in New York, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and New Orleans. They had crumbling buildings. They had used textbooks. They had half the budgets of white schools. Yet every one of those 5 black high schools out-tested every white school in those cities. So we were able to do that at the turn of the century when racism was enshrined in law. We had no political representation, but our families were whole and our spirits were of self-determination. So the question is, if we were able to compete under conditions of segregation, why are we not competing today when blacks are running the same institutions over the last 50 years that are failing low income? The biggest income gap is not between whites and blacks, it's between blacks and blacks. If racism were the sole culprit, why are not all blacks suffering equally?
Right.
So the biggest crisis we're facing in America today is not racial. It is moral and spiritual. According to a Harvard study, 100,000 children are dying each year needlessly. The highest cause of death of young people in the black community is homicide. Among Appalachian whites, is prescription drugs. And in Silicon Valley, where the median income for a family is $190,000 with 2-parent households, the suicide rate among its teenagers is 6 times the national average. So how can you? So that's the crisis that we face. And as Christians, it seems to me that if we have to look at each other through the prism of race and emphasize our differences, it prevents us from addressing the moral and spiritual freefall that is consuming our children.
So you see that as a problem that's affecting people of every race,
Yes.
basically.
We have a group that we write about. It's called Voices of Black Mothers United. These are thousands of black mothers who lost their children to homicide. They found a way to turn pain into purpose. So we have organized them in chapters all over the country. We just had a retreat of the leadership. And these moms are reaching out because when you lose a child, 35% of the marriages go under. Many of these other people commit suicide or they are subjected to personal crisis. But we are coming there, and these moms have promoting cooperation with the police. We've been able to engage the police. That has ended up reducing violence in Racine, Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
But we've also reached across the races to embrace moms who lost their children to homicide and suicide in what we call a collective. This is what Christians ought to be doing. We ought to be coming together and bringing people together who share a common malady, and that is the death and destruction of our children. But if we have to look at each other through the prism of race, it's going to prevent us from addressing the real crisis in our society.
So it doesn't sound like you're a fan of the 1619 Project view of America.
It is a stain in this country's for these. In fact, what we did in 1619 and 2019 when Nicole Hannah Jones issued this declaration that America is incurably racist, that its institutions and that all white people are villains and all black people are victims. You know, where do you go when you say something's in your DNA? You can't change it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it proved to be a fantasy, a lie. So what we did was, since the messengers of this destructive message was black, we decided that we were going to bring together 23 black scholars to challenge that. So we published a book, Red, White, and Black, Saving America from Revisionist History and Race Hustlers.
Mm-hmm.
And we authored essays to challenge with facts, but we weren't offering a counter argument. We were offering a counter narrative that challenges the premise of the book. And we've developed school curriculums from it that's now been downloaded 200,000 times in all 50 states. The book sold out within 4 weeks. And the publisher had to go back and republish because there's never been a book of essays that sold out in a month. Because America, and we had documented evidence that when whites were at their worst, blacks were at their best. We have examples after examples of blacks who achieved against the odds.
You know, the historian David Hackett Fisher, he wrote the book Albion Seed. He wrote sort of a follow-up to it. I think it was called African Founders that I read. And it really was essentially the story of blacks being brought here, from the time they were brought here as slaves from different parts of Africa, for an extended period of time. And he told a lot of amazing stories about what they accomplished. And I was reading that and I'm like, I'm kind of embarrassed to say I was not familiar with a lot of this. And sometimes I do surveys. So I asked somebody one time, I'm like, on Twitter, I just did a Twitter survey. How many of you all have heard of Robert C. Weaver? And I have a lot of people, like I was a scholar of urban policy at the Manhattan Institute. So most of my followers are urban policy people. Over 80% of the people had never heard of him. And I'm like, we go through all these Black History Months for years, and we never even heard of the first Black cabinet secretary, and that was just one of his many roles that he had. And I'm like, how is it that with all this history that we supposedly talk about, we actually don't seem to have a very good history of Black America?
It isn't. It's grievance-based. In fact, in our essay, you talk of Robert Smalls, who was born in Sumter, South Carolina, and was working on a supply ship and stole it. And he and 6 of his members picked up their families and turned the ship over to the Union Navy. And he was celebrated throughout. Long story short, he became the first naval officer and later became a member of Congress during Reconstruction and a millionaire, and purchased a plantation on which he was a slave and allowed the wife of the slave owner who had developed dementia to remain in her master bedroom in an act of what I call radical grace. There are endless examples of Elijah McCoy. That story.
Yeah. I think Robert Smalls was like co-founder of the Republican Party in South Carolina. And he's another one. I asked on Twitter, how many of you all have heard of Robert Smalls? again, 90% of people had never heard of him. Never heard of him. And,
Or
and again,
Biddy Mason.
yeah, I'm not saying I know who all these people are. How is it possible that like stories like this don't get told? It's really amazing to think about. It is wild. Again, we're supposed to be thinking so much about Black history, but we never seem to actually study it.
We really don't, but it's slanted. It has to fit a race grievance narrative, because there are people who profit from keeping people aggrieved.
Right. Yeah.
That's like, and it's part of why all these stories are suppressed. You know, since we wrote in our book, since the 60s, the poverty programs did more to disable the Black community than anything that the White Citizens Council did over the course of decades. We've documented the fact that every decade after slavery, Blacks made dramatic progress. When we were denied access to hotels, we established our own hotels. In the Bronzeville section of Chicago in 1919, Blacks had 731 Black-owned businesses, 100 million in real estate assets just in the Bronzeville section.
Right.
And all the other Black Wall Streets. That capital came from Black churches that had burial societies because we didn't have insurance companies.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an amazing example of people achieving against the odds and turning pain into purpose.
Mm.
That's the American story. Mm. It isn't that all whites are villains and all Blacks are victims. That's the most. It's racist to assume that white supremacy, that somehow Blacks can only be delivered through the agency of white oppressors. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, a lot of my, a lot of my audience, of course, skews conservative, a lot of them. And so I'm interested in what you think of some of the conservative approaches. So I think there's like a couple of different things that I hear from conservatives when it comes to poverty and race. The first one is what I call is the I don't see color.
Exactly.
It's I don't see color. It's a colorblind society. Whereas I think, personally, I think most people actually do see color and it affects them. The other one is like, it's all about the culture of poverty, which I think there's probably some truth in that, but also it does seem like an excuse to simply say, well, we don't have to do anything because it's their own fault that they're poor. So I'm wondering what you think of those conservative kind of attitudes towards poverty.
One thing that has attracted me to the conservative movement, it was Dr. King said, the ability to be self-critical. Mm-hmm. They were willing to argue among themselves. And I wrote an essay a long time ago in '83 when Reagan was in office and the Heritage Foundation had their leadership. And I said that for conservatives to talk about colorblind society, the only time you hear about conservatives on race is when there's a disgruntled white fireman.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The other time is that conservatives have been heard on poverty is to just cut programs. They're guilty of being low budget liberals, rather than promoting reform. That if you are for limited government, and I am, if you're for shrinking government, then you got to also be in support of expanding local mediating institutions. Mm-hmm. The very institutions that Blacks used to prosper in the midst of slavery, conservatives should be the first to say these small informal institutions need to be respected, they need to be strengthened, and rather than just saying, well, when you think about all of the scholars, Larry Mead, Charles Murray, Robert Rector, what are their writings have been on poverty? It's all been negative. It's all been, okay, let's put conditions on food stamps. I'm for all of them, but conservatives need to do more than just talk about what they're against. Mm-hmm. They need to promote and support institutions within low-income communities that share their same values. We need to invest in these institutions. That's what the campaign that the Woodson Center is on now. We have 2 books now, that Red, White, and Black. Then the second one that just came out, Pathways to American Renewal, which gives further evidence of the redemptive qualities that is inherent in our society. We give example after example of Blacks who achieved when, for instance, when the Fugitive Slave Act occurred in Topeka, in Ohio, we had they call 3 black barbers in Toledo, Ohio. They operated an underground railroad that consists of 1,200 white farmers and 2 Indian tribes, because they would cut the hair of the white bounty hunters, and they knew where they were going to be searching for the next slaves. And in the course of that time, 50,000 blacks escaped to the Underground Railroad because of this network. That's the American story. And so we celebrate this in these books. And this is what we ought to be teaching our in other words, there are too many naysayers who I call crucifixionists.
What do you mean by that?
All they talk about is the crucifixion and not the resurrection. The crucifixion is half the story. Yeah. But the only reason that we talk about the crucifixion is to then give us an opportunity to talk about the resurrection.
Well, I like that story about Ohio because it gets to something that my observation of kind of rhetoric on race in America in general is that it's like we're in a tort case or a lawsuit. And you've got sort of these woke people saying, white people are to blame for this problem. Therefore, there need to be reparations or there need to be something there. But on the conservative side, what I see is basically this idea that it's about proving that I didn't do it. And if you say I'm not responsible, then it's like I don't actually have to do anything. It's like it's not my fault anymore. And there's no sense of solidarity with people there. It's like, okay, I can just kind of walk away from it. Whereas those people in Ohio, they did not do that. They said, well, we're going to, I'm not making slavery is not my fault, but I'm going to be part of the solution. All right, I'm looking here, but it looks like Mr. Woodson's video may have frozen. We may have an internet connection, and he dropped off. So I'll just sit here for a minute and see if he pops back on. But I wanted to say, again, thank you for showing up. He is really a dynamic person, as you can see, dynamic speaker. If you ever get the chance to see Bob Woodson speak, do not pass it up. All right, we're back. No problem.
Okay.
Not a problem. I'll just restate the last question that I had, which was basically, I love the Ohio story, because I kind of feel like in our society today, it's like we're in a lawsuit. We're in a tort case. And it's like white people are being sued for having caused these problems to black people. And the white person's kind of conservatives, let's just say, attitude has been, I just want to raise enough reasonable doubt so that I can say I'm innocent. And therefore, not only do I not have to pay reparations or whatever, I don't have to do anything. I can just walk away from black America and say it's not my problem anymore. Whereas I love the Ohio story was people who could have said, well, slavery is not my fault. I didn't enslave anybody. So why do I have to be part of the solution? But they just said there's a problem and I need to be part of the solution. So I feel like there's this missing step of like solidarity of like actually caring about poverty, even if you don't think it's your personal fault that it happened. It's still your personal responsibility to do something because these are your fellow citizens.
Exactly. We should never be motivated by guilt.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a foundation upon which you can build anything.
Mm-hmm.
But as Christians, we ought to be bound by a duty to do the best for the least of God's children.
Right.
I serve at this organization, and I serve the least of God's children, not even out of compassion. I serve out of godly responsibility.
Mm.
You know, just as we serve our children,
Mm-hmm.
we don't serve our children out of a sense of compassion. If our children, it's snowing outside and it's 2 a.m. and they call and say, "Dad, I need you."
Mm-hmm.
You don't say, "Well, it's snowing outside. You
Right.
know, it's not convenient time for me to kind of get in the car. So let me call me when it stops snowing."
Right.
And that's how I see my obligation to serve the least of God's children. I've had
Right.
gang members stay in my house
Mm.
when they were going through a transformation and redemptive process. So I'm all in.
Mm-hmm.
And I just believe everybody should be all in being an agent of God's blessings to the least of God's children. We are obligated. It's like I feel like I'm doing a life sentence without the possibility of parole.
Yeah.
That's how we should look
Right.
at our obligation to serve. I don't have any
Right.
choice.
Right.
If you are a believer, you don't have a choice.
Yeah. Well, you could have retired a long time ago, and you're still at it. Still coming on podcasts like mine, which I'm grateful for.
Well, you retire from a job and you expire from a calling.
Yeah. Yeah. There
I
you go.
always say that God doesn't always choose the most capable. He chooses those who are called and he makes them capable.
Mm. I agree. You call yourself a radical pragmatist. So as we're all assuming everybody's listening to this, they want to do something, but this is like something that a lot of us don't have a lot of expertise in. It's not our comfort zone. What are some things that actually are working out there in the world? Maybe things that they could support or get involved with out there in the world that's making a difference.
Well, part of the paradigm that Roger Center, you know, and the book of Joseph is in Genesis is a foundation upon which the Woodson Center has been established. That if it was not for the pharaohs, it wouldn't be a Joseph.
Hmm.
And a pharaoh is a wealthy, person who's able to dream bad dreams in good times, but also willing to reach across racial, ethnic lines and empower a 31-year-old uneducated Hebrew shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
And because God has anointed that person with solutions to problems. And so, but what Pharaoh brings is money and power. And that's the partnership that is going to save America. And so we have, the Woodson Center has over 3,500 grassroots Josephs in 39 states. And they are healing agents within these communities, redeeming gang members, taking people off of welfare, instilling in people a sense of their own value and self-worth. But they're also, one of our pharaohs was working with a Joseph and donated a 5,000 square foot building. Mm-hmm. So that person could operate out of their home into an institution. And we have all kinds of Pharaoh Joseph relationships where people are coming in and offering help to people who are helped themselves. So we have some rules that you should follow, because just because you're well intended, it doesn't mean that your actions are helpful. So we say, for instance, there was one of our groups that had a shelter for women who were abused, and every year volunteers would collect toys and give them to the children. Everybody was happy except the mothers. Mm-hmm. So the second year, they permitted the moms to volunteer to earn toy vouchers, mm-hmm. to babysit, to clean, to do things, to earn vouchers. The toys that were collected were put into a store, and the moms at Christmas time took their toy vouchers and purchased toys for their own children. Mm-hmm. At the Christmas party, they gave the toys out. That's an example of, and when you go into a community, don't assume that nobody is there that is doing something. Always look for the Josephs in these communities.
Right. Well, that's a good example of, if somebody like me decided to go into like a high poverty neighborhood of any race and say, well, let me set something up, it's
Exactly.
not going to work. I can tell you that right now because my world has been completely foreign to that.
Right. Find out what's already in our book. We talk about what are the principles of helping.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, for instance, Jeb Bush, who was he and his wife. I introduced him to a woman in public housing called Dorothy Perry, who's like the Mother Teresa in Dade County.
Mm-hmm.
And Jeb saw these 20 kids and wanted to take them to his house and then the Disney World. I said, no, don't you do it.
Mm-hmm.
You do it in partnership with Ma Dot.
Mm-hmm.
And so he did. And so the kids said, Ma Dot and these nice people took us out for a day. Otherwise, you're competing.
Mm-hmm.
So what you want to do is strengthen existing relationships that already exist in that community. I also had some women come in to mentor, and they said, well, they're going to go home and change. I said, what change? Why?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm going to know. Always identify with where people want to be, not where they are.
Mm-hmm.
So when the women went dressed the way they do to work, the girls were just in love with it. So how'd you get see that necklace and those shoes? And so in other words, we should take the best of who we are in our process of helping people to inspire them. But the main thing is to, rather than coming in, what are the best ways of healing the human body? You strengthen its own immune system,
Mm-hmm.
right? The first thing a doctor does isn't say, "Oh, you got heart palpitations. You need a heart transplant." To be out of the door.
Right.
But what a doctor prescribes is that which is least intrusive. When we're coming to help people, we should prescribe that which is least intrusive. And first of all, respect that there are indigenous healing agents in any community. First, seek to find what's already working there. Then you can supplement and augment that which is already there.
Mm-hmm.
So that people will be agents of their own uplift. The other thing we do when we help young people and others, that we say this isn't charity. You have to give something in return for what you receive, reciprocity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you don't have to give anything to me, but you must do something for others. When we stopped gang members from fighting, we said to them, what are you passionate about? They became coaches to other kids.
Mm-hmm.
So they used their influence to broker a truce, and they became surrogate fathers to the kids. And so they wanted to set up football teams. And so I said to a group of 5 business guys, I need money for my kids to get uniforms, but you're not going to give them to them. The uniforms are going to be given by the coaches.
Mm-hmm.
You can be there. So sometimes when you want to give to people, give through existing indigenous healing agents. So that your gifts can strengthen an existing relationship. These are people who are going to be there when you're gone. So those are some of the simple steps that we describe in our publications, ways that people outside can help, that empowers the people and respects them. No one should have to give up their dignity as a condition for receiving help.
No, I agree. When we talked the other week, one of the things that you talked about that really blew my mind, that I would love for you to talk a little bit about, were all these Black Christian schools in these areas. Because, I think it's another one. There's all these, this whole, classical Christian schooling movement, Christian schooling, movement. And yet we don't know what, I didn't know that all this stuff was going on and these sort of like Black Christians. I'd love for you to tell people more about that, because I know schooling is something people get very passionate about.
Oh yeah, well, one of the symbols of competence and commitment is the Piney Wood School, day school. It's a 115-year-old Black boarding school located near Jackson, Mississippi. It's a 1,000-acre farm, and it was started by a man named Lawrence Jones, who was from Idaho and the first Black with a degree. He went there with $1.50, teaching one student to read, the offsprings of ex-slaves. And that thing has blossomed into an institution. It was profiled on 60 Minutes. They only take, today, they stayed true to their Christian values. They only take kids from some of the most challenged families. And they stay in residence, and 100% of them go on to college. So we're raising a $50 million Joseph Fund, and with it we're going to help. It's a historic place, but we also have 10 or 15 other small Christian schools that the Frederick Douglass School for 80 years has served in the low-income communities of Chester, Pennsylvania. It is an island of excellence there. And so we want to be able to help these fledgling schools to close the gap between what they can afford to do versus what they're capable of doing. So we are going to, with our Joseph Fund, pour money into them and also bring them together in a collective, so that when issues of reparations or other silly stuff comes up, it'll be the voices of the parents of these students to speak out, not political pundits.
No, that's great. Again, these are stories that I think are just not out there. And so, I encourage people to get some of the books and publications that you put out there, because it's encouraging to hear good stories, because all we ever hear is the bad. But I guess I just get to another question, which is, the Bible does say, the poor will always have with us. How do we avoid getting discouraged when we don't see like transformation in 6 months or even 5 years? And how do we stay persistent in the face sometimes of the fact that it's a long road?
Well, first of all, when the Bible says the poor would always, they don't mean it has to be the same people.
Yeah. Right.
Didn't he say it's the same people?
Right.
But if you read some of the stories that and see some of the videos that we have, they show you instances where there has been immediate and change. We had one, for instance, in 22 years ago. There was an area called Benning Terrace in Washington, D.C. 53 gang murders in a 5-square block area in 2 years. The police were afraid to go in there. I coached 5 Christian ex-offenders who had the trust and moral authority, and they went into that community after a 12-year-old boy was killed, and it made national headlines. And they brought the leaders to my office downtown, where we had a meal. And we negotiated a truce, and we went from 53 murders down to 0 for 12 years.
Wow.
And it was profiled, and so we celebrate that. And there have been other breakthroughs like that, so that your listeners, if by turning into our channel, you will read about some inspirational stories every day. There are some major breakthroughs where change has occurred. It doesn't have to take a year or even a 2. That was an instant 2-week investment that produced outcomes. The problem is that the interest of the poverty industry isn't served by publicizing these acts of resurrection and restoration. And that's why we're trying to raise the Joseph Fund and also push our books out there, so that we can develop a platform so we can bring all these people together by the thousands at some event where we're celebrating the renewal and redemption of the Piney Wood School, for instance. In other words, we need the moral equivalent of a George Floyd on our side. We need something that draws public attentions to God's blessing and God's renewal. And we've got to think big. That's why the Woodson Center, we're thinking big. We $50 million. Can you imagine the political parties spent $1 billion and raised and spent $1 billion in 3 months to lose an election?
Right.
And we're talking about $50 million that will restore a whole movement. So I am optimistic, and if you were to talk to some of the Pharaoh supporters of the Woodson Center, they will, because we take a lot of people on site visits. If you want to visit the Piney Wood School, or if any of your listeners want to pick up that phone and call us and say, well, Bob, show me. I guarantee you, you will not be the same. We've taken people to Piney Wood who's even flown in on their private planes. And we gave them $2.5 million out of our Joseph Fund that we raised on a match. FC Johnson Foundation CEO visited. He gave $500,000 toward the match. So that if you come and see, it'll inspire you to know what America is on the mend.
Well, you sounds like you believe progress is definitely possible. And where do you think America could get to in terms of progress on these issues in 10 or 25 years?
You should really see Bishop Fulton J. Sheen's sermon he gave 50 years ago when he predicted what was happening today. He said that the 3 pillars of American civilization is pietas, love of God, love of neighbor, and love of country. If any one of those is compromised, the whole society is doomed. But he says that the eagle is a symbol of America, and it nests high in the crevices in the mountains. And at a certain point, the eagle or the eaglet gets to a certain age, the mother takes the feathers out the nest and pushes it over the edge, and it begins to fall to the earth. And just before it crashes, she swoops down, picks it up, and takes it back up to the top, and repeats that process again until she learns to fly. He said America has been taken back up to the top of the mountain, and God is going to allow her to soar again. So I just think that it's immediate. I don't think it's going to be a slow. We need a reformation in America. We're not going to get a reformation by electing people to office. Reformation has to come from within the culture itself. And it starts with just a small group of individuals. If you look at the Clackham group at the turn of the century in England, 20 people on the leadership of Wilberforce changed the whole nation of Great Britain, of England, to vote down against slavery at a time when it was hostile to their economic interest. That's an example of reformation. And I believe America is going to undergo a reformation. We're seeing it right now, where there's this challenge of this DEI foolishness. America does not have a race problem. America has a grace problem. And that grace problem has to be fixed among believers. We have to have moral courage to push back against the naysayers. You take enough from those who love you to deal with those who don't love you. And so those of us who love one another, we must come together in common community and provide the kind of strength strengthening of one another until we can have a major impact on others. So they begin to believe and act as we believe and act.
Well, that's a great vision, and I love the. I know you didn't come up with the Fulton Sheen sermon; you just quoted it. But let's hope that Reformation happens, and certainly let's not close our hearts against it, and do what we can to make change where we are, in whatever we're doing. So again, my guest again today has been Bob Woodson, the president of the Woodson Center. There's links to it, which I highly encourage you to check out, as well as the new book he edited, A Pathway to American Renewal, Volume 2. Mr. Woodson, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a great honor.
Well, thank you. And I've enjoyed the encounter.